A Maine doctor has taken his passion and turned it into a global initiative. Sierra Whaley went to Pittsfield to learn how Dr. James Fullwood is expanding his leadership skills to advance healthcare in Maine.
Maine leaders need to make sure that we have the appropriate education and training. As the market changes, we need to change.
Dr. James Fullwood has worked at Northern Lights Sebasticook Valley Hospital since 2013 as a podiatrist and surgeon. While his education has served a great purpose, he wanted to learn more. So he traveled to Nigeria to build diabetes awareness.
It was a different world. It was beautiful. It was engaging. There was so much to do, so much to learn.
He and 10 other doctors saw the need for diabetes access and education, so they founded the International Limb Salvage Foundation, a nonprofit that helps West Africans become more aware and self-sufficient. He also wanted to bring that knowledge and leadership to Maine, so he found a program that helped him advance even more.
The Daniel Hanley program is based right here in Maine. Hundreds of doctors, nurses, now even PAs have gone through this program right here in the state of Maine because Dr. Daniel Hanley believed that this type of leadership, and there are other forms of leadership, is important to advance healthcare in the state of Maine.
As he continues to work with the grassroots leaders and build orthopedic and endocrinology fellowship globally, Fullwood has found more of himself.
It's not about the name that you have on your coat or where you went to school. It's about what's happening now in this market, and do you have the leadership skills and the training to lead these healthcare organizations to where they need to be.
Sierra Whaley, WABI News, Pittsfield.